the nightmare of a new order. A Führer, his people, and race. Crimes against humanity. A world of chaos and destruction. This is the story of humanity's darkest hour. The abyss. Buchenwald, April the 16th, 1945. A few days after its liberation by US soldiers, the people of nearby Weimar are made to visit the concentration camp.
You're dealing with a defeated population that has also got to take responsibility for some of the biggest crimes ever committed. The murder of 6 million Jews simply by virtue of being Jewish is mass murder on a scale beyond anything that is conceivable in terms of ordinary warfare.
For Germany, 1945 is the year of total defeat. Really a defeat on a scale never seen before. Not just military, not just in the political sense, but also a moral defeat.
It's a vision of hell, just a few kilometers from the center of Weimar. The Allies hope that the sight of this horror will force the Germans to confront their own responsibility.
The notion that we knew nothing about it is a post-war myth. The American photographer Margaret Burke-White went round Buchenwald when the good citizens of Weimar were made to come up, and they're all saying, we knew nothing about it. And she says, when she writes about this, it's become a national hymn. That's what everyone is saying.
Similar scenes play out throughout Germany in the spring of 1945. The Allies face a difficult task. What are we to do with the Germans? Many of them were enthusiastic supporters of the system for 12 years. Others looked away, indifferent. Who should be punished? How can Europe be rebuilt after such devastation?
How do you set in place a system to make sure that this kind of war never happens again?
In Berlin, fanatical Nazis fight on, even after Hitler's death. But most Germans resign themselves to defeat. On May the 8th, Germany surrenders unconditionally. The Second World War is over in Europe. An estimated 65 million people have died. There's no agreement on the exact figure. The Soviet Union, with at least 27 million dead, is hardest hit. But in proportion to its population, Poland has suffered the heaviest losses. 6 million Polish citizens die in the war and through the Holocaust. That's 17% of the population. Yugoslavia, Hungary, in France, the Netherlands and Greece have also suffered heavy losses. In cities throughout Europe, people celebrate the end of the war and welcome Allied soldiers. But there are terrible scenes in the liberated concentration camps. For many, the Allies' help comes too late. In Bergen-Belsen alone, 13,000 prisoners die after the liberation.
It was a traumatic experience for the soldiers. There are several reports where soldiers say, "We could smell the camp before we saw it."
6 million European Jews have been murdered by Germans and by their accomplices. This is a crime against humanity. In addition, hundreds of thousands of forced laborers, homosexuals, and political opponents, 290,000 disabled people, and 220,000 Sinti and Roma have been killed in organized campaigns of murder. Millions of Germans made this mass murder possible. Not just those who actively participated in deportations and killings, but also those who excluded the vulnerable and profited from it, who didn't help the victims. Few of these acts will be punished or atoned for after 1945.
מספר האנשים שהיו שותפים פעילים במעשי
The numbers of people who actively participated in the crimes of the Nazis run into the tens of thousands. But the numbers of people who were prosecuted, let alone executed, were so small that the punishment stands in no relation to the scale of the crimes.
More than 8.5 million Germans joined the Nazi Party. And in 1945, it's not yet clear how comprehensively the victors' criminal proceedings will be applied.
Die Deutschen haben fast alle bis zum letzten Atemzug gekämpft.
Almost all Germans fought to the last breath. They had an incredibly bad conscience.
Wahnsinnige Angst.
They were terribly afraid that the enemy, now the victors, would treat them exactly as they had treated other peoples.
Genauso verfahren wie sie mit anderen Völkern.
German soldiers in particular know what they have done. At the end of the war, there are more than 3 million German prisoners of war in the Soviet Union. Almost 8 million are held by the British and Americans. The Western Allies don't have the facilities to cope with such huge numbers. The US Army sets up provisional camps along the Rhine. Up to 2 million former members of the Wehrmacht and the SS are crammed onto farmers' fields surrounded by barbed wire. There's very little food. In the first weeks after the surrender, conditions are critical.
Of course the US could have looked after these people better, without any problem, no question about it. But you have to consider the psychological aspect. Let them experience some tough conditions, let them suffer a bit. Then they can think about what they've done.
By the late summer of 1945, the provisional camps have been closed down, and many German POWs are being forced to work, some clearing German mines from the Atlantic Wall.
Of course that was against international law, but you have to look at it from the point of view of the other countries. Should our people risk their lives to remove German mines? No, the Germans can remove them because they put them there in the first place.
In liberated Dachau, a prisoner recognizes his tormentor. There's terrible fury at the Germans. This scene was filmed by the French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson. Bresson was himself a prisoner of the Germans during the war, and after the surrender, he makes a film about returning French forced laborers. He's there when former prisoners give vent to their anger at an interim camp in Dessau. In this scene, a forced laborer identifies a Gestapo informant. Here, former prisoners help to expose Nazis who were trying to pass themselves off as prisoners.
Of course people take revenge. Old accounts are settled. There are weeks of anarchy, and above all, this period is marked by violence. The war doesn't just suddenly end. It's like a supertanker. It doesn't just simply come to a standstill. It goes on. The violence continues.
Spontaneous acts of revenge. a weak echo of the millions of German acts of violence. Many soldiers of the victorious armies see women as legitimate spoils of war. One estimate puts the number of rapes at 860,000. In this amateur footage, filmed after the surrender, German civilians in the Borislavka district of Prague are about to be shot dead by Red Army soldiers and Czech militia. The Wehrmacht and the SS had held on to Prague to the bitter end. Helena Dvorashkova, seen here as a young child with her parents, was an eyewitness as her father filmed from the balcony of their apartment.
There are houses on the left, and on the right there's a great big field. I remember the moment my grandmother pressed my face into her white apron so I wouldn't see.
The sequence that you see is one of the examples of the extreme brutality that some of the Czechs applied to the Germans. You don't know if they were Nazis, you don't know if they deserve to go to prison, but nobody deserves to be shot. And this is something that really characterized the immediate aftermath of post-war, this absence of any law and justice.
Some Jewish survivors decide to hunt down Nazis. One 50-strong group is called Nakam, Hebrew for revenge. It's founded by Abba Kovner from Vilnius, a writer and partisan with plenty of experience fighting the Germans.
He wanted revenge. It was quite obvious to him that the Allies, including the Soviets, wouldn't take revenge on behalf of the Jews. The Jews had to do it themselves.
Most of their operations fail. Abba Kovner, seen here as a witness in the Eichmann trial, plans a poison attack on captured SS men. The attack goes wrong, and shortly after, Nakam is disbanded.
Much later, close to his death, Abba Kovner told me, "I'm glad it didn't work out." Because then we would have been the same as the Nazis. I didn't want that.
Czechoslovakia, summer 1945. 3 million Germans are forcibly expelled. Before the war, the German minority was Hitler's excuse to annex the Sudetenland. The Allies now intend to put an end to this problem. The Germans are forced to leave their homes and join a giant trek to the west.
They believed that many of the problems of Second World War and the rationale for it came because the states of interwar Europe in the in aftermath of Versailles were ethnically heterogeneous. So if they were to be ethnically homogeneous, that problem would not reappear. Nobody asked about the human cost.
A Czech propaganda film welcomes the expulsion. The defeat affects these Germans even more harshly than others.
And so Sudeten Germans were pushed out, Germans from East Prussia, former East Prussia were pushed out, Germans from Silesia were pushed out. But it has to be remembered that the same shift of the borders happens further east as well.
The Soviet Union absorbs eastern Poland. In exchange, Poland receives German territory up to the rivers Oder and Neisse. The populations concerned must leave their homeland. 1.7 million Poles in the east and a further 3.5 million inside the country. On the German side, 12 to 14 million people flee their homes or are expelled.
When we look at the expulsions, they are a terrible situation for those people who are forced out of their homes. And there's no question that a great number of people died. But it in no way mirrors the brutality of the invasion of and the expected outcome of what Hitler had planned for the Central and Eastern European lands.
Further atrocities now come to light. By the end of the war, the Germans have stolen up to 20,000 children from the occupied regions in the east. This was the work of the SS Lebensborn organization, which becomes the subject of much speculation after the war.
Lebensborn was not a place where young, nubile, pretty Nazi women went to have a lot of sex with young, nubile Nazi soldiers. It was a place where you went when you were a young German woman with good racial credentials, and you were pregnant and not married.
The Lebensborn nursing homes looked after mother and child. The SS devised a special ritual for newborn babies to receive them into the Aryan community in place of a Christian baptism.
It's a race war. We have to protect our race. And outside of normal families, we have to ensure that we can expand this German super race too. So children are stolen from the occupied territories.
Stolen children come to this Lebensborn nursing home in Bad Polzin, today's Polzin-Streu. Little Klaus, holding hands with his Polish grandmother, was still called Czesław when this picture was taken. In 1942, SS men kidnap him from his grandparents' home. When his mother gets back from work, he's gone. Czesław becomes Klaus. He's not allowed to speak Polish. The SS issue new papers to conceal his origins. His social security card is printed with the letters OK, Ostkind, or child from the East. In 1944, the Schäfer family take him in as a foster child. Mother Eva has 4 children of her own, and now a Lebensborn child too. Father Johannes is an SS brigade leader. They're a picture book Nazi family. Klaus doesn't learn the truth until he's 75 years old.
It's a cruel fate, and for today's older adults, it's almost impossible to come to terms with the conditions under which they came into the world.
Some of the youngest victims of the war don't know if their families are still alive. In a newsreel made in the Soviet occupation zone, they look for their relatives.
Joachim Dilz vor einem Jahr in der Berliner Brunnenstraße in einem Pappkarton gefunden. Barbara Hoffrichter aus Ostpreußen. Sie verlor unterwegs ihren Treck.
Meine Mutter ist tot, mein Vater war zuletzt in Berlin-Tempelhof als Soldat. Karl Weiß war in Auschwitz.
Wurde im KZ von den Eltern getrennt.
At the end of the war, every 4th German is searching for relatives. 40 million people are moving across a devastated continent. Some are fleeing their homeland. Others hope to finally return home. Prisoners of war, freed concentration camp inmates and forced laborers, abducted and uprooted by the Nazis.
It's really in 45 that the German economy collapses, if you like, across the finish line of defeat into something close to complete disintegration at this point. This is the moment at which millions of Germans actually face starvation, the kind of starvation which they had inflicted on the rest of Europe up to that point.
For the thousands of Soviet prisoners of war in Germany, the situation is especially tense. After the liberation of a camp near Paderborn, a group of men, weakened by forced labor and starvation, fight over a piece of bread. Their future is bleak. Stalin sees prisoners of war as cowards.
That's how it was under the Soviet regime. Anyone who'd been taken to Germany or to any Nazi-occupied country as a forced laborer or was a prisoner of war was stigmatized for life.
Stalin comes to an agreement with the Western powers that all Soviet prisoners of war will be returned, but many don't want to go back. In the camp at Plattling in Bavaria, a prisoner of war cuts himself badly to try to prevent his return. American soldiers display him in front of the camera.
Instead of being welcomed home, you were immediately labeled as a treacherous possible criminal who'd possibly collaborated and so on. And so these people were very, very often, for the most part, either killed outright or largely sent to the Gulag.
Stalin doesn't even spare his own family. When his oldest son Yakov Djugashvili is taken prisoner in 1941, Stalin categorically refuses a prisoner exchange. Yakov dies on the electrified boundary fence at Sachsenhausen. France, shortly after the liberation. Women accused of cooperating with the Germans are humiliated, regardless of whether their behavior was due to calculation, naivety, or love. Mere suspicion is enough to make them the target for revenge.
It's a sad and violent reaction after a terrible and violent war against people who are seen to have been collaborating and perpetrators of this terrible system. And it would always depend on each individual case, because some of the women really did deserve to be punished, but not in that way. And some of them were innocent or punished for vindictive and unpleasant reasons.
Women are humiliated, collaborators violently attacked. Those who aided and profited from the German occupation are hunted throughout Europe. Among them are notorious figures like Pietro Koch, a fanatical partisan hunter in northern Italy. Under the eyes of the Germans, he tortured Jews and communists to death. His execution in Rome is a public event and a public signal.
You need a small group, it mustn't be too big, that can be set apart, marginalized, made up of the most obvious collaborators, perpetrators who worked for the SS, who worked for the Gestapo, and they are executed or publicly punished. And then the others, the rest, are able to say, well, we were the good guys.
In Germany, it's about more than individual guilt. The Allies have clearly set out their political aims. They want a democratic, denazified Germany. They want to turn the self-appointed master race into peaceful neighbors.
What happens is that there are so many people who've made their peace with the Nazi regime, who've been complicit in the Nazi regime, who've been involved in perpetration on behalf of Nazism, that it really is a massive problem.
It's easy to remove Nazi symbols from buildings, but how do you identify and re-educate 8.5 million party members and countless sympathizers? In the American occupation zone, every adult has to fill in a questionnaire to qualify for ration cards. That's 13 million Germans. In the end, 99% are classified as passive followers or simply innocent of wrongdoing.
The denazification procedures themselves, I think, were not very successful. It was very easy to tell stories. So denazification itself didn't assist in sorting out who was guilty, who was not. It just assisted in a kind of massive cover-up job on the part of Germans.
Das war ein pauschales, summarisches Verfahren.
It was a one-size-fits-all summary procedure, but it was still important because it made a new start possible, a new beginning. It didn't damn the German people for all time.
The Allies go about it in different ways. Denazification in the West is soon halted. In the Soviet zone, it becomes a communist-style purge. At the end of the war, Soviet forces set up 10 special camps in their occupation zone. The biggest is Special Camp Number 7, formerly Sachsenhausen concentration camp. One of the prisoners is Wilhelm Sprick, seen here in a self-portrait. He's arrested by Soviet military police, age 16, after being denounced for slandering and insulting Stalin, and he's sentenced to several years in the camp. In 1950, Wilhelm Sprick is released and forbidden to speak about his imprisonment. But he records the horror in his art. On one of the pictures he writes, Sachsenhausen in old concentration camp garb.
There are undeniable similarities. They were not, however, labour camps in the same way as was the case under Nazism, so they were not used as slave labourers. And the victims within these special camps did include people who should certainly not have been there, but it also included many ex-Nazis and people who definitely were people who should have been interned for the acts they had committed under the Nazi regime.
The Soviets decide that in their zone the elites need to be fundamentally replaced. 90% of the teachers and the judges must go. So-called people's judges and new teachers are trained in crash courses. The criterion is their loyalty to the new system.
Even if you had been sort of some minor Nazi, if you professed your loyalty to Stalin and you took up a position and never made a fuss, and you were well-behaved Stalinist, and your children went to the Komsomol, school of whatever, then you were pretty well okay.
Most of the people who went along with the Nazis got off scot-free in the West and the East. The GDR couldn't change the average citizen. They just carried on under the socialist flag. It was different with the elites. And in the West, they carried on under a new system too. That was no problem.
Anti-fascism becomes the grounding myth of the GDR, Communist East Germany. The evil Nazis are the others. The capitalists, Junkers and imperialists are all in the West. And apart from communist heroes, the Nazis' other victims are forgotten, especially the Jews.
In the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, the emphasis was on combating fascism, not about the question of what had actually happened to the Jews. You could say the persecution of the Jews was simply swept under the carpet. It was hushed up.
In November 1945, surviving senior Nazis face an international tribunal. 21 defendants, representing the party, the state, industry and the military, are tried as principal war criminals. It's a revolution in international law.
This is the first time in human history that a group of individuals who work for a state and are servants of its sovereign are put on trial for something called international crimes.
One of the 4 charges is crimes against humanity, a new criminal offence created to prosecute acts of violence against civilians. Barrister Hersch Lauterpacht plays a leading role in the drafting of the charge. He was born in Polish Galicia and studied law in Lemberg before emigrating with his wife to Britain.
What Lauterpacht is interested in is looking at the ways in which international law can protect each of us because we are human beings. Not because we're a member of a group, but because we are living, breathing, sentient human beings. And his basic idea was that every human being has minimum rights under international law, including in times of war and conflict and horror and atrocity.
Lauterpacht has a personal stake in the trial. On its very first day, the topic is a crime against humanity in Lemberg, Lauterpacht's former home.
At that point, The 20th of November 1945, he has no news as to the fate of his parents, his siblings, his nieces, his nephews, his cousins in Lemberg. And at that very moment, on the first day in the trial, a Soviet prosecutor describes what happened in Lemberg.
Thousands of Jews were murdered in an operation guided by the German occupation forces. Lauterpacht's family was among them. The Nuremberg trials are also the beginning of the historical processing of Nazi crimes. Documents, photographs, films, and witness statements are admitted. Evidence of a new dimension in crime.
What was important was that it would showpiece the horrors that had occurred, the invasions, the acts of killing, the atrocities, and so on and so forth. And it was broadcast daily on the newsreels, and it was in the front pages of the newspapers most days.
The Americans conduct regular opinion polls in their zone. According to these, the defeated Germans take a largely positive view of the principal war crimes trial. 80% believe the trials are fair, and 70% consider that the defendants are guilty. The victor's message is clear. There will be justice in the place of arbitrary despotism.
Put simply, the Second World War is a war of good against evil. In spite of all the problems there are on the Allied side, all the war crimes the Allies also committed, there simply is no Holocaust, no mass deaths of Soviet prisoners of war. It's a different dimension, and so one can speak of a certain moral superiority.
The legacy of Nuremberg is a warning to all governments, not least today.
Those judgments went straight to the United Nations General Assembly. They were endorsed, and they became the basis for modern international law. And if you move forward to Rwanda, to Yugoslavia, to the International Criminal Court, to Iraq, to Syria, to Guantanamo, to the Rohingya, every road leads back to Nuremberg.
Thousands of Germans appear before the courts in war crimes trials. But the majority of the guilty avoid prosecution. By 1949, 12,478 Nazi war criminals have been convicted. Yet at least 200,000 people were directly involved in carrying out the Holocaust. In addition, sentences are often lenient. Offenders are released early or declared unfit for detention.
So it's a very difficult dilemma that are faced by the Allies as to what to do. Do you punish everybody and then have this very unstable society that becomes resentful, or do you punish the top criminals that you try in Nuremberg and some of the other trials that follow, and rather turn a blind eye to other people's Nazi legacy?
Many Nazi criminals seek to evade punishment. They can count on discreet assistance. Ricardo Clement, supposedly from South Tyrol, applies to the International Red Cross for travel documents. His real name is Adolf Eichmann, and he's one of the organizers of the Holocaust. His false papers enable him to evade justice. The main escape route leads from Germany across the Austrian Alps to South Tyrol. A network of helpers in Austria and Italy guides the fugitives across the Alps unnoticed, with false papers, accommodation, and food. The route continues on through Italy to South America. South Tyrol plays a part in almost every escape story. After 1945, the Alpine region is a perfect bolt hole for Nazis.
South Tyrol was on the escape route to Italy, and the population there were very friendly to the Germans, and so they helped all the fugitives from Germany. and South Tyroleans were considered stateless in 1945. This statelessness was very useful to Nazi fugitives for getting papers from the Red Cross.
Senior figures in the Catholic Church are especially helpful to the fleeing Nazis.
They saw communism as the arch-enemy of the Church, and National Socialists were obviously anti-communist. They saw allies there, and they also argued on religious grounds, saying that forgiveness, forgiving and forgetting was the best policy, looking to the future.
One person who benefited from the Church's anti-communism was SS General Otto Wächter. He fled to South Tyrol and hid for years with another SS leader in a mountain hut high in the Alps.
The plan was, and was implemented, that they hid above 2,000 meters. Burckhardt said to Wächter, the British are too stupid and too lazy, the Americans too stupid and too lazy. We go up. We hide above 2,000 meters.
It must have been almost idyllic. Their families visited them. They took pictures. They went for walks, mountain hiking and skiing. It was virtually an alpine idyll.
In 1949, Wächter leaves his hiding place and travels to Rome. A Catholic bishop, Alois Hudal, finds him work and a place to live. Otto Wächter never makes it to South America. He dies in the summer of 1949 in the arms of Bishop Hudal. This unholy alliance of Nazis and priests corresponds with the beginning of the Cold War.
Pursuing and trying Nazi criminals is no longer the priority. The fight against communism is becoming more and more important. So, are these former SS men and Nazis more important as defendants in a trial, or as potential allies in the fight against communism? This isn't about Eichmann, Mengele, and a couple of others. This is about thousands and thousands of cases.
A Jewish family in the late 1930s. Nina is not quite 10 years old in these holiday pictures. Her little brother Peter was probably born in 1933. Friendly neighbors looked after these films during the war. Robert dies in Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Rose and the children are taken to Auschwitz. On the ramp, mother and daughter are selected for a work detail. But Rose doesn't want to be separated from Peter. On May the 15th, 1944, they enter the gas chamber together. "6 million European Jews fall victim to the Nazis' racial mania. In Latvia, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Greece and the Netherlands, more than 70% of the Jewish population die. The largest group of victims by some way are the 3 million murdered Polish Jews. More than half the Jewish population of Hungary and Albania die. Hundreds of thousands are deported from other countries and murdered. The US Army sets up camps in Germany for Jewish survivors. This one is at Föhrenwald in Bavaria. It was once a housing estate for workers. In 1945, there are about 30,000 Jews in the displaced persons camps.
Very few Jewish DPs ever thought of staying in Germany. So it was quite clear that each of these camps was a waiting room, waiting for the opportunity to emigrate.
Most of the survivors want to emigrate to Palestine, where the dream of a Jewish state seems to be becoming a reality. But the authorities in the British Mandate deny them entry. And the USA won't relax its immigration laws either.
Immediately after 1945, there wasn't a single country that said, after this catastrophe, we are opening our doors and all of you can come.
In the US occupation zone, the Jewish refugees run the camps themselves. After years of living in fear of their lives, there's a great need for education and culture. Theatre groups bring the horror of the concentration camps to the stage. The survivors cut themselves off from their German neighbors. Playing football against Germans is forbidden.
The Jews saw the Germans, rightly, as the people who 3 or 4 years before had been German soldiers and had murdered them. There was no denying that fact.
Contacts with Germans are largely limited to bartering. Holocaust survivors have things to offer that German civilians can't get: coffee, cigarettes, chewing gum. Things the Germans deliver to the camps, but distribute far less of to the German population.
The Germans saw the displaced persons as a privileged group. They got more to eat, and there were less restrictions on them than on the Germans. Anti-Semitism, which was still very widespread in Germany after 1945, was naturally directed at the people living in these camps.
The police in Munich talk of ceaseless hustling by these layabouts and work-shy elements. They talk of a rabble with criminal facial features. Munich's police chief describes the fight against the black market as a cleansing operation. German anti-Semitism has not disappeared with Hitler's death. In December 1946, more than a third of Germans still hold anti-Semitic views. 18% are even radical anti-Semites, according to a poll by the Americans in their occupation zone. The pollsters consider a further 21% are anti-Semites, 22% are racists, and 19% are nationalists. Only a fifth display no such leanings. For many Jews, Germany is the blood-soaked earth upon which they will never set foot again. Others return to the land of the criminals and build new Jewish communities, but they are few and far between.
They felt they were Germans, and that was their tragedy. They didn't leave Germany because they didn't feel German, but because the non-Jewish Germans told them they weren't German. They were more comfortable in German culture than in other cultures.
That's true of the actor Fritz Kortner. Shortly after his return from exile, he plays the leading role in the film The Last Illusion. He bases the screenplay on his own experiences. Kortner plays Professor Mautner, who has to justify his decision to return to Germany.
Auch wenn es brutal klingt, das sind doch Menschenfresser, die da drüben. Kannibalen, ja, das sind sie. Das spürst du denn keinen Hass, keinen Abscheu gegen sie?
In meinen besten Momenten? Nein.
Das verstehe ich nicht. Also mitgemacht oder zugeschaut haben sie doch alle.
In his memoirs, Kortner describes his first encounters with Germans after his return. Though he tells them about the 11 members of his family who were gassed, there's no willingness to recognize his misfortune. Germans persist in their belief that no one else's suffering comes close to their own.
Many German Jews who return in British or American uniforms may encounter former neighbors and hear from them, "Yes, it's all right for you. You were much luckier than we were. You can't imagine what happened here, especially during the war." There's often a reversal of roles of victim and perpetrator that strikes many German Jews as utterly surreal.
Anti-Semitism does not just remain virulent in Germany. Returning Jews encounter it in neighboring countries as well. Joseph Feingold, born in Warsaw in 1923. In the mid-1930s, his parents, Rachel and Aaron, move with their 3 sons to Kielce. His father Aaron has found work there as a carpenter. After winning the lottery, his family can even build their own house. Happy years before the Germans invade Poland. In the war, the family becomes separated. Aaron finds refuge in the Soviet Union with his older sons. At the end of the war, they return to Kielce to look for Rachel and their youngest. As they cross the border into their old homeland, they're pelted with stones.
The Jews describe the return of the survivors as a tragedy. People who narrowly escape death come up against the indifference and the hostility of people who have taken over their homes, believing that they would never return.
The central clearinghouse for survivors in Kielce is the office of the Jewish Committee. A few hours after his return, Joseph Feingold hears shouting in the street.
There was a crowd of people outside, getting larger and larger, smashing windows and shouting some incomprehensible demands or obscenities. They finally broke the door down and started dragging us out of the room.
They were just ordinary citizens. Some soldiers joined in, police and militia. The Jews experienced violence almost everywhere they returned, especially in Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, less so.
On July the 4th, 1946, 40 Holocaust survivors are murdered in Kielce and 80 more wounded. The trigger for the pogrom is a claim by a 9-year-old boy that he'd been kidnapped by Jews.
The Kielce pogrom was a turning point in the history of the Jews in Poland. It led to mass emigration. Tens of thousands of Jews fled Poland, mainly to camps for displaced persons in Germany, Austria, and elsewhere.
Joseph seeks out the protection of the American occupying forces, staying in a displaced persons camp near Frankfurt before emigrating to the USA. The number of Jewish refugees arriving in the American occupation zone from Eastern Europe reaches its peak at the end of 1946, at a total of 150,000. Germans do not welcome the survivors. The provincial office of the Protestant Church in Kassel sends a questionnaire to 25 parishes. One of the questions is,
how is public opinion reacting to the fact that the Jews in Poland were forced to emigrate and that they have been accommodated here in our living space?
The Fasanenhof parish promptly sends its summary of the local mood. One opinion is frequently heard.
There must be reason nobody wants them. The Poles are now doing exactly what we are being punished for.
After so many years of indoctrination, it's actually not surprising that there was a high degree of anti-Semitism in the population. And we can still see the consequences of that in our society today.
Germany, as an example of what human beings can do to one another, is a warning from history.
The Holocaust is the
most extreme form of a universal human disease. Under certain circumstances, any person can become a mass murderer. Any one of us.
If you're German, these are our fathers, grandfathers, or great-grandfathers. And they were neither less intelligent nor less morally anchored than we are. They were very, very much like us, and we can't pretend that we are different or better.
Der bedrückendste historische Befund für mich jedenfalls.
The most depressing historical conclusion from the history of National Socialism, at least for me, is how many people were prepared to conform, to go along with it, even if that involved murderous barbarity. And I'm afraid that this conformism is a phenomenon that we did not necessarily leave behind us at the end of National Socialism.
The important thing is that in a democratic system, we should constantly be asking ourselves, what's actually happening right now, and what should I be doing to work against anti-democratic tendencies?
The problem with the struggle against populist movements is that it's a very particular kind of fight. You can't fight it with conventional means. You have to find new methods. Against the language they use, against the manipulation of public opinion. Democracy must not behave as stupidly as it did in 1928 and 1933.
The lesson is never again. That is the task for all opponents of barbarism. There is no guarantee.